Hey guys, tonight we slip into your tall, mud-spattered boots and take a stroll through Victorian streets. You know, those places where horse hooves outnumber car horns, and one stray puff of coal soot gives your lungs a permanent 1800s souvenir. Towering brick buildings lean in like nosy neighbours. Gas lamps flicker in the gloom, and carts clatter over cobblestones so uneven they could probably fracture both your ankles before breakfast. You probably won't survive this, but don't panic. At least you'll look classy while coughing on soot. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop your location and the local time in the comments, so I know what kind of clockwork you're travelling on. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You take your first cautious breath, but the air is heavy with smoke. The smog, or London particular, as some locals ironically called it, clings like a sour perfume. It's thick, damp, and far from romantic, unless your idea of romance is squinting through pea soup fog just to find the bakery. Horses jangle past with carts piled high with coal, their iron shoes clipping rhythmically. Each clomp echoes against the cramped townhouses. You dodge puddles that definitely aren't just water. That smell tells you otherwise. Welcome, traveller. This is your stage, and Victorian society is the play. People bustle around, each defined by the rigid layers of social class. Merchants stride with tailored coats and stiff hats. Clerks clutch ledgers like life rafts, and ragged children dart between them, selling matches or newspapers. Respectability hangs in the air heavier than the soot. Every glance reminds you, appearances are everything. One historian even wrote that respectability was the golden currency of the age. And truly, currency it was. Without it, doors stayed shut. You walk on, weaving past a lamplighter, climbing his ladder to brighten the gloom with a hiss of gas flame. This is one of the few public servants that people actually look forward to seeing. The city police, in their stiff blue uniforms, aren't always greeted so warmly. Still, the lamplighter is a reminder that technology is in flux. Imagine the thrill of stepping from the shadows into streets suddenly illuminated. Early proof that modernity was shimmering just within reach. Yet, historians still argue whether these streetlights truly improved public safety, or whether they were more of a symbolic modern glow, like a fancy screenshot filter. A few paces further, and you're nearly bowled over by a grand lady sweeping by in a sedan chair. 4 hired men carrying her with huffing breaths. Her skirts are spread like theatrical curtains, silently declaring, "Yes, my waist is constricted to the size of a broom handle, and yes, I outrank you." You clutch your lungs tighter against the soot, but she chugs along like a mobile fashion statement. For her, this parade is survival, a daily au courant billboard of wealth and breeding. You sidestep respectfully, even if the corner of her skirts threatens to mop the puddle onto your boots. Printed alongside, you find gruesome crime reports and serialized novels from rising authors. Recall that people used to crowd around the latest Dickens chapter as hungrily as modern teens devour episodes of a new series. Each chapter was cliffhanger fuel, and no one wanted spoilers shouted in the street. And we have to address the smell again. because honestly, there's no escaping it. Horse dung piles high, rivers reek suspiciously, and household chamber pots are just casually emptied out of windows. Congratulations, you're reliving the infamous Great Stink years, when hot summers baked sewage into a city-wide miasma. The stench was so terrible, Parliament literally had to hang soaked curtains dipped in chloride of lime near the debating chamber just to cope with their jobs. Yes, lawmakers argued bills while gagging. In a sense, democracy itself smelled questionable. Printed alongside, you find gruesome crime reports and serialized novels from writing authors. Recall that people used to crowd around the latest Dickens chapter as hungrily as modern teens devour episodes of a new series. Each chapter was cliffhanger fuel, and no one wanted spoilers shouted in the street. And we have to address the smell again, because honestly, there's no escaping it. Horse dung piles high, rivers reek suspiciously, and household chamber pots are just casually emptied out of windows. Congratulations, you're reliving the infamous Great Stink years, when hot summers baked sewage into a city-wide miasma. The stench was so terrible, Parliament literally had to hang soaked curtains dipped in chloride of lime near the debating chamber just to cope with their jobs. Yes, lawmakers argued bills while gagging. In a sense, democracy itself smelled questionable. But don't think it's all grime and decay. Stroll a little further west and you'll see posh districts of stucco-fronted homes, well-polished iron fences gleaming, and carriages arriving at garden squares brimming with primroses. It's still Victorian London, yes, but here, the horse dung gets shoveled faster, and the fog seems somehow more aristocratic. You lower your gaze and try to fit in. Rule number 1 in this world: don't stare too long at anyone above your station. Eyes down, polite nod, keep walking. Every gesture operates like code. If your hat lifts too late in greeting, you've committed a social felony. If you cross the street to avoid some dirt, you better check who's watching, because appearing squeamish signals weakness. Respectability is no casual accessory. It is survival shorthand. Interestingly, among your many fellow pedestrians are new immigrants arriving from Ireland or the colonies, making the city an even denser maze of accents and backgrounds. Historians still argue whether Victorian streets were melting pots of mingling nationalities or castles of hardened prejudice that kept communities firmly apart. Likely, it was messy and a little bit of both, like your first attempt at baking a Victorian sponge cake. An odd sight catches you. A street vendor sets up contraptions selling penny ice cream, a true novelty. A sweet frozen treat you can actually afford. Imagine industrial Londoners licking ices churned with hand-cranked machines while dodging horse carts. That sugary invention instantly wins popularity, because who wouldn't want a cold snack in a world where deodorant and refrigeration are under development? As you end your stroll, soot clings to your collar. The voices of merchants rise in chorus, and the omnipresent fog curls round you like smoke from a magician's hat. You're not just walking a street, you're walking inside a code of conduct written on every brick and every cracked cobblestone. And while your modern sensibilities may itch at the grime, your Victorian peers wouldn't even flinch. For them, this urban stage is the only reality. Rigid, smoky, unforgiving, and absolutely breathtakingly alive. And so, your thick-soled shoes shuffle onward under the gas lamp's glow, carrying you deeper into a society where every turn of the corner brings another unwritten expectation you're supposed to just know, like instinct. You wake before dawn, the sky still a dim, smoky grey, and the first thing you feel isn't the softness of your pillow. It's the weight of duty. It presses down as heavily as the brick chimney stacks crowding the skyline outside your window. A rooster crows faintly in the distance, or maybe that's a milkman rattling his bottles. But you don't have the luxury of snoozing your way into the morning. In Victorian times, sleeping in isn't a charming lifestyle choice, it's practically a moral sin. Early rising proves industriousness, and industriousness proves respectability. If you cling to your pillow too long, you risk being labelled slothful, and in this world, that's one of the scarier 7 deadlies. The bed creaks as you pull yourself upright. Your blanket is wool, scratchy enough to exfoliate your soul, and the room is cold, since central heating has not yet deigned to visit the common household. Instead, your fire docks from last night holds the ghost of warmth, a few pale embers wheezing faintly. You have to decide whether you'll spend precious coal getting it roaring again, or simply layer up and deal with it. Coal costs, after all, and a good household is thrifty almost to obsession. First stop, the wash basin. Forget hot showers with pressure. You hunch over a porcelain bowl, scoop lukewarm water with a pitcher, and splash it onto your face. Soap bites sharply, drying out your skin faster than desert air. If you're lucky, the water doesn't smell like last night's pipes. Historians still argue whether most Victorians truly cared about daily cleanliness, or whether it was more an upper-middle-class obsession. Either way, you scrunch your cheeks and rinse, muttering under your breath that your refreshing splash feels more medieval torture than spa treatment. By now, the house is stirring. In better off families, servants scuttle along narrow hallways, bustling like shadows, lighting fires, setting out kettles, and brushing boots in preparation for the family's descent. If you're of more modest means, you play both actor and crew, rushing from room to room, trying to balance your personal appearance with household chores. Here lies one of the odd contradictions of the age. The home is worshipped as a temple of respectability, but the work that makes it gleam is invisible, ignored even by its beneficiaries. Next comes your clothing. Oh boy, prepare yourself. You're not just putting on clothes. You're assembling a uniform in society's endless play. Layer by layer, these garments are embedded with rules sharper than taxes. As a man, you fumble with starched collars so stiff your neck can barely rotate, tug on trousers that bloat with scratchy wool, and smooth a waistcoat down your chest, so patterned it could pass as wallpaper. A hat sits ready by the door, not for warmth, but because stepping out bareheaded is practically a misdemeanor. Shoes, freshly polished, gleam like dark mirrors. If you're a woman, the ordeal turns operatic. Stay calm, breathe shallowly. The corset awaits. A maid, or your sister, or honestly, anyone with grip strength, cinches the whalebone cage around your waist. You feel your ribs compress, your lungs negotiating peace terms, your spine muttering curses. Hourglass is the ideal, and fainting couches exist for a reason. Over layers of petticoats and chemises, a gown cascades down, stiffened with crinolines so wide you accidentally clear entire tabletops when you turn. The ritual isn't just fashion, it's survival. Each loop and lace proclaims your identity before you've even opened your mouth. Breakfast, when it finally arrives, follows just as rigid a script. A well-run household produces tea steaming in delicate china cups, bread rolls or porridge, maybe eggs, and if you're truly living the good life, a sliver of bacon. But notice your posture as you eat. Back ramrod straight, chewing daintily, no elbows on the table. Even at dawn, etiquette has its claws in you. Napkins rest precisely on laps, and bread is broken. Not cut, because apparently slicing bread at the wrong angle signifies barbarism. Yes, in a world where cholera reinvents itself every summer, bread etiquette is what keeps you civilized. In many middle-class houses, family prayers accompany breakfast. Religion infiltrates daily rhythm so tightly that missing prayer feels as conspicuous as shelling up barefoot. Words echo across the table about grace, gratitude, and proper conduct. For children, this is also a not-so-subtle reminder that moral behavior begins before toast is even buttered. Imagine taking a bite of porridge with one hand while memorizing scripture with the other. Good morning indeed. Children, in fact, are shooed along with schedules as strict as the adults. They're instructed to speak little, listen much, and absorb table manners like miniature sponges of propriety. One quirky tidbit: children were explicitly trained not to show enthusiasm for food. Too much excitement about jam or sausages risked looking greedy. So yes, young Victorians learned to underreact to cake. Generations of kids forced into solemn nods at sponge puddings. Your heart bleeds. After breakfast, household members scatter. Men often head off to work in offices, factories, or shops. Newspapers tucked under arms like badges of ambition. Women retreat to household management, an occupation dressed up as leisure, but in reality requiring endless lists, servant supervision, and budget calculations sharp enough to rival accountants. A woman mismanaging household finances could sink her family's reputation as quickly as any debtor's prison. The morning routine isn't just preparation. It's a social audition scored daily. Now for the less privileged, mornings look starkly different. The sound of factory whistles slices through the air before sunrise, summoning workers to smoky buildings where 12-hour shifts wait. A child might gulp down thin gruel and hurry into textile mills. Fingers nimble from youth exploit it for their size. The streets teem with them as the day unfolds. Ragged boys hauling coal, girls balancing trays of flowers to sell. Historians still argue whether Victorians sincerely believed child labour was good character training, or whether that was just a convenient excuse to keep wages low. Whichever the truth, the morning ritual for these families was less refinement, more survival. Glancing at the clock, perhaps a heavy brass contraption ticking with ceaseless authority, you realize what morning rituals really accomplish. Rehearsal of social rank. Washing, dressing, eating, praying. It's a ceremony that makes everyone know their place before the sun is even fully risen. Clothes pin you into identity. Meals shape your manners. Prayers frame your duty. Wouldn't you know, simply brushing your hair wrong, choosing the wrong bonnet ribbon, or forgetting to polish your boots might be enough to provoke whispers on the street. One humorous note to close your morning slog. Some Victorians swore by health routines designed to invigorate them, like gulping down vinegar or dousing themselves in cold water daily. Imagine willingly pouring freezing water over yourself in London winters. For circulation, they said. Honestly, you deserve a medal just for surviving one morning without frostbite, fainting corsets, or bread slicing scandals. So you breathe in the coal-tinged dawn, straighten your posture, and prepare to march into the day. Sleepy defiance might whisper from your modern bones, but here, in Victorian life, order begins at dawn, and no one questions it. Tomorrow, the routine will repeat again and again, until you almost forget that ease ever existed. You step out into the bustle with your freshly starched collar or tightly cinched corset, and almost immediately you feel the invisible net of rules surrounding you. These aren't the written decrees of Parliament, but the whispered commandments of society. The unwritten shoulds and oughts that decide whether you're celebrated, ignored, or quietly destroyed. And the most suffocating net of all, gender expectations. From the instant you open your eyes in this Victorian world, your role is scripted according to your sex. For men, the narrative leans toward duty, work, provision, and honor. For women, obedience, purity, nurturing, and appearance dominate. A man must represent strength, self-restraint, and respectable ambition. A woman must embody gentleness, self-sacrifice, and unwavering modesty. Deviating even slightly from these guidelines isn't seen as personality. It's treated like rebellion, and rebellion here rarely ends with applause. Take the case of women, for example. You're told that your highest calling is marriage, that every lesson in deportment, needlework, and pianoforte is basically training for the role of respectable wife. Education often prepares you less for independence and more for social utility. Literature and languages might be allowed, but mathematics or science, too unfeminine, some say. Historians still argue whether this was done consciously to preserve patriarchy or unconsciously as a byproduct of social tradition. Either way, your algebra dreams are politely strangled before bedtime. Meanwhile, your corset isn't just squeezing your lungs, it's squeezing your existence. Clothing itself enforces gender corrections. A woman's bodice keeps her posture upright and delicate. A man's tailcoat stiffens his frame into the ideal of male gravitas. Each stitch whispers who you're allowed to be. Even walking paces differ. Rush too quickly as a woman, and it looks unladylike. Stroll too languidly as a man, and you risk whispers of idleness. Step frequency apparently reveals your virtue, one awkward truth among many. For men, the expectations sound more freeing on the surface. After all, men command households, vote, well, at least some men, since class complicates things, and hold professions. But don't be fooled. Your script is just as binding. Your value depends on your ability to provide. You are measured by the firmness of your handshake, the squareness of your jawline, and the punctuality of your bill payments. Failure in business or inability to maintain a family could strip away your social worth faster than spilt tea stains a tablecloth. So yes, gentlemen had their cages too. They were just made of mahogany office desks rather than lace ribbons. And because every public act is laden with meaning, relationships between men and women are choreographed like minuets. Simply speaking without a chaperone present can ignite scandal. And scandal is the atomic bomb of Victorian social life. So naturally, your conversations become coded performances. A gentleman compliments your needlework, except with a modest smile, not a grin. Too much enthusiasm could suggest impropriety. A lady praises your new cravat. Nod, maybe blush slightly, then retreat, because standing too long risks rumour. Honestly, it's like living in a perpetual middle school dance. Except the chaperones have sharper eyes than hawks. Here's the irony. The Victorians glorified separate spheres for men and women, yet society constantly collided them. Men inhabit the public sphere of commerce, politics, and education. Women are relegated to the private sphere of home and morality. But those spheres overlap when it's convenient. For instance, while a man can control politics outright, women control it indirectly through influence in salons or parlour chats. You're not officially steering the ship, but you're the murmuring voice suggesting which course seems safest. Even in constraint, subtle power sneaks in. There are quirky exceptions too. Some Victorian women carved space in literature. Novelists like the Brontes and George Eliot, pen name alert, thrived while cheekily disguising or reshaping themselves within society's expectations. Publicly, they might still appear docile, yet on the page, they roared. Likewise, a few men, including reformers and radical thinkers, challenged rigid masculinities, questioning whether ambition needed to be paired with emotional constipation. These scattered dissenters lived like quiet fireworks in a sky otherwise clouded by rulebooks. Historians candidly admit they argue about how tightly ordinary Victorians followed these codes. Did everyone truly obsess over female chastity, or was it more of an ideal for moralists rather than a daily reality? Were working-class families freer in some ways out of sheer practicality, because financial survival outweighed propriety? Some evidence suggests working women took jobs in factories and markets, wielding more independence than middle-class guardians of drawing rooms. Others argue that every class internalized the same ideals, just softened by necessity. The debate rages, proof that even in a time obsessed with certainty, lived reality was a smudge of ink on a carefully printed page. But imagine you're a teenage girl here. Your giggles must be muted, your posture trained, your reputation guarded as though it were priceless china. Your peers whisper about dowries instead of hobbies, about whether pale complexions hint at delicate refinement or poor health. Meanwhile, teenage boys are pressed early toward apprenticeships, university, or the military, taught to stand with stoic dignity. Free choice? Almost non-existent. Society hands you a role before you've had the chance to audition. One amusing superstition about women's behaviour was the fear that reading novels, yes, novels, could overexcite female minds and weaken them. Can you imagine being warned that too much chapter binging might ruin your chances of marriage? By that logic, half the ladies lounging on fainting couches should have been casualties of serialized Dickens. Luckily, most ignored the warnings, devouring books like clandestine sweets. Your day continues, and as you watch people around you, you realize the strangest truth. Everyone is performing. Gender expectations are theatre roles reinforced by repetition. And just like in theatre, missing a cue or improvising too wildly risks jeers from the audience. Your corset or collar digs into your ribs, not just physically, but psychologically, turning every movement into a message broadcast to the world. So you breathe shallow breaths, adjust your hat or skirts, and play your part. Because here in the Victorian universe, survival isn't only about coal smoke, cholera, or the crowded streets. It's about staying inside the lines of gender carved deep into the culture. Stray outside, and you'll find not freedom at first, but gossip, punishment, humiliation. The curtain has risen, your spotlight burns bright, and until the day gives way to evening, you will continue the role assigned to you, one careful breath at a time. Your morning routine still buzzing in your muscles, you now face one of the trickiest but most essential rituals of Victorian life, the art of leaving your calling card. Picture it, tiny, stiff, cream-coloured rectangles of paper, neatly printed with your name in careful script. They don't look like much to modern eyes, but in this world, they're the golden keys to society's gates. Forget bank accounts. Forget your charisma. Without a card to slip onto a silver tray, you're socially invisible. You tuck a handful into your pocket or reticule, heart pounding a little, because this is more than a courtesy. Handing over a calling card is the 19th century equivalent of sending a friend request, except if you mess up, instead of just getting ignored, you're shamed over tea across half of London. The ritual plays out like choreography. Arrive by carriage or on foot, ascend the polished steps of your acquaintance's townhouse and be greeted by a servant. That servant does not smile warmly. They are society's gatekeepers as much as bell pull operators. You hand over your small rectangle. The servant places it on an elegant tray, stacked with others, a stiff little graveyard of reputations waiting to be judged. Then the butler carries the tray to the mistress or master of the house, who reviews it. They might nod, yes, acceptable, or tut, beneath us. Congratulations, you've just auditioned for inclusion into their social circle. The tiniest details matter. A folded corner, for instance, might signal the card was delivered in person rather than by proxy. Writing your address proves you want reciprocal visits. Some women scrawled initials like PPC, pour prendre congé, signalling they were leaving town and politely saying goodbye to your connection. Historians still argue whether everyone genuinely obsessed over these details, or whether etiquette manuals exaggerated the paranoia to sell more advice books. Either way, Victorians bought those manuals the way people today binge self-help podcasts. One mainstream fact, calling cards were so essential that printers flourished across towns. Every middle-class family eventually armed itself with a box. The cards became collectibles. Trays overstuffed with them made parlours resemble modern bulletin boards, except sharper in judgment. Declining in society wasn't so much a personal choice as the natural consequence of losing spot on someone else's tray. Let's not forget, this isn't just about friends. Calling cards showcase power. Aristocrats wielded them like crests, reminding you that their name, even in ink, could overshadow yours. Middle classes used them as aspirational ladders, inserting themselves among better families. A shop owner prospering from industrial wealth needed nothing more urgently than a tray brimming with upper crust names displayed like trophies. And if you didn't leave your own in return. That was basically a 19th century unfollow button. Quirky tidbit time. Some elites had cards so ornate they bordered on absurdity. Engravings, gilded edges, even quirky illustrations showed off eccentricity to trusted peers. One eccentric gentleman supposedly printed not just his name, but his full family genealogy, turning casual visits into genealogical lectures. Imagine handing someone a card so cluttered they need spectacles just to chat with you. Overcompensating at its finest. And of course, there were scandals. Imagine a gentleman accidentally leaving his card at the house of a married lady he fancied. That little square of pasteboard could ignite rumours hotter than a coal furnace. Suddenly neighbours whisper, was it innocent? Was it bold flirtation? Sometimes even the servant who delivered the tray had thoughts, because honestly, everyone in this world is watching everyone else. For women, the rules became especially suffocating. Dropping off cards wasn't just courtesy. It was one of the few socially acceptable ways to shape networks beyond the home. Making the rounds of calls formed a full-time job, though one draped in lace and parasols. Ladies would step into glossy carriages, roll along streets for hours, stopping at doorsteps to leave cards with footmen, then retreat without ever seeing the hosts in person. You'd spend an afternoon essentially scattering business cards disguised as pleasantries, and it was genuinely exhausting. One scholarly debate still swirls. Did calling cards truly provide opportunities for women to influence their circles? Or did they serve mainly to enforce restrictive hierarchies? Some argue they allowed women to foster social agency in an otherwise narrow sphere. Others see them as just another cage, disguising control with courtesy. Truth probably lies clattering somewhere in between, like that stack of cards barely contained by the silver tray. Of course, not everyone had the luxury to play this game. In poorer districts, a visit meant knocking on a neighbour's door for mutual aid, not passing parchment like its currency. For them, kinship and gossip formed social networks, not embossed print. The class divide shows in stark relief here. While you fuss about card designs, others worry about dinner. Yet the funny thing is, both sides worry equally about reputation, just the tools differ. Back in the parlour, you sip tea and watch keenly as your hostess flips through her collected stack. She pauses at one name, lips pressing tight. That pause speaks volumes. Tomorrow, you learn Mrs. So-and-so and Lady What's Her Name no longer exchange cards. That's it. The friendship evaporated. Whole alliances shift with nothing more than ink on cardstock. Honestly, Victorian cards make modern social media drama look tame by comparison. Joke 3 for good measure. At least if someone disliked you today, you could block them with a click. In Victorian times, a person could dramatically refuse your card at the door. Imagine the awkwardness as the butler hands it back to you, eyebrows arching as if to say, "We decline both the paper and the person." Ouch. And yes, that happened. So you clutch your little stack like it's your very survival. One call completed, Another demanded. It's not about friendship at its core. It's about choreography. Each exchange a subtle dance of approval, a flutter of identity. And as you climb back into your carriage or gather your skirts along the pavement, the lesson hits hard. In Victorian society, even something as simple as handing over a piece of paper is laced with risk, status, and consequence. Tiny rectangles, big reputations, and the performance goes on. The fog still swirls outside, but you're no longer out on the pavements, flashing calling cards at butlers. You've just stepped into a dining room, the stage as meticulously choreographed as any opera. The table stretches like a polished runway of mahogany, sparkling with silverware so excessive you could conduct an archaeological dig with it. Yes, welcome to the nerve-wracking world of Victorian mealtime etiquette, where one wrong spoon could whisper scandal louder than any shouting match. The white tablecloth glows under chandeliers, every fold ironed with military precision. At each place setting lies a stack of cutlery, layered like geological strata. Knives, fish forks, dessert forks, soup spoons, oyster forks. You name it, they've got it. The rule? Start at the outside, work your way in. But beware, hesitation equals ignorance. If you falter, your neighbour already notices. Silently tallying your breeding. Social rank isn't just signalled by what you eat, but how you nibble it. Your host glides into the room with theatrical timing. He doesn't just sit anywhere. His chair is right at the head of the table, opposite his wife, who has performed the Herculean task of arranging the guest list so conversation never falters. Positioning matters a great deal. Placement at the middle shows middling importance. Near the host signals favour. One mainstream historical fact: the Victorian dinner party was more about cultivating influence than satisfying hunger. You came not to eat, but to display polish, connections, listening skills, and charm. Hunger was secondary to reputation management. You adjust your posture. Upright, shoulders careful, napkins spread over your lap with great solemnity. Elbows strictly off the table. Unless you enjoy being remembered as the clumsy savage of the evening. Bread appears. Don't cut it. Tear off pieces delicately with fingertips. Something so simple as buttering too large a hunk of bread could sink your evening prospects. You prepare as faithfully as though you were studying for an exam. Except here, the pen is a fork and the grade is whispered behind your back. Conversation begins, restricted by rules as stiff as the collars encasing your throat. Victorians divide dinner talk into safe and unsafe. Safe, literature, sermons, polite gossip about the weather. Unsafe, politics, religion debates, money. And never, absolutely never, does one speak of the bodily functions of digestion at the table. Despite this being the one place where digestion is happening. Jokes about flatulence? A one-way ticket to pariah land. Soup is served, steaming fragrantly. You remember, tilt your spoon away from you while you sip. Why? Because if you tilt toward yourself, the soup might splatter. Such chaos would ruin your credibility. Noise discipline matters. Loud slurping was practically barbaric in these circles. Do it once, and you doom your family lineage to generations of shame. Or at least, it feels that way. You sip quietly, listening to the polite, clinking echo like a chorus of glass bells. Of course, not everyone adhered perfectly. A quirky tidbit: in more eccentric circles, some families actually trained pet parrots to interrupt dinner with phrases like, "Take care how you eat." What a horrifying dinner companion, if you ask me, but also an incredible party trick. There are anecdotes scattered in Victorian memoirs about dinner guests being heckled by birds mid-bite. Imagine sweating bullets over cutting your meat correctly when Polly suddenly becomes the etiquette police. Speaking of meat, you await your entree. Victorian cuisine could vary wildly. At grand dinners, you'd get roasts, fish courses, delicate puddings. For upper-middle homes, maybe boiled beef, mutton chops, and vegetables boiled until they spiritually evaporate. Vegetarians existed, though fringe. They were called Pythagoreans by some, in reference to the Greek philosopher. Historians still argue whether widespread blandness in cuisine was due to scarcity of spices, change in taste, or an obsession with moral purity. A stew could pass as nourishment, but rarely as thrill. Here comes one of the big nervous points: drinking etiquette. A servant hovers, pouring wine, usually sherry with soup, claret or port with meat. But here's the twist. Women were often discouraged from drinking very much, lest they appear improper. So you, as a woman, might just politely sip and smile, while your male counterpart happily knocks back several glasses. Imagine balancing a corset squeeze, buttering bread in cautious increments, and not being allowed to dull the evening with a proper gulp of claret. Brutal. Dessert time provides another gauntlet. Fruits arrive, potentially with attached cutlery you've never seen before. There's a special knife for oranges, a spoon for melons, prongs for grapes. Yes, grapes. You experience the panic of looking across the table, subtly copying whichever aristocrat seems most confident. One slip here, and your reputation slides straight into the custard dish. And let's not forget manners extended beyond the meal itself. Arriving too early to dinner? Rude. Arriving too late? A declaration of arrogance. Staying too long afterward? Tiresome. You had to time your exits like a general retreating from battle. Smooth, graceful, socially lethal when mishandled. But beyond the utensils, rules, and pressure, there's the deeper truth. The dining room was where families displayed themselves to one another and to the world. Furniture varnished until it shone. Carpets swept. Flowers fresh. Servants appeared at just the right moment, vanishing afterward with ghost-like efficiency. Like a stage, every actor knew their cue. And if a guest violated expectations, the ripple of discomfort could last days, retold in whispers at church, repeated kindly to your face, cruelly behind your back. Occasionally, of course, accidents happened. Someone dropped a fork or spilled gravy over a starched waistcoat. Here the gracious host or hostess stepped in with calm laughter, diffusing the mistake into harmlessness. But beware, the memory wouldn't vanish. One particularly elaborate story. A woman once sneezed so violently, her false curls fell into the soup tureen. Outwardly, everyone stifled chuckles. Years later, people still whispered about the great weak soup tragedy. Victorian humour may have been stiff, but boy did it have teeth when you slipped. And when the meal finally ends, the ladies glide out first, retreating to the drawing room to chat lightly, while the men remain to sip port, smoke cigars, and discuss serious subjects away from feminine ears. Again, the gendered separation. The dining room fractures like a stage splitting into acts. Men carve their stories by firelight. Women glide among tea trays, everyone performing their part in the dance of civility. You exhale as the dishes vanish and the etiquette gauntlet ends for now. You've survived soup spoons, squishy bread rules, social whispers, and even grape forks. Not easy, but necessary, because in this society, the way you eat reveals who you are, and your manners taste sweeter or bitterer than any pudding. So straighten your back, polish that last crumb from your fingers when no one looks, and remember, one wrong spoon may be remembered longer than your cleverest conversation. The dining room doors close. Silverware clinks fade into memory. And now the atmosphere shifts to something simultaneously exciting and terrifying. The blurry battlefield of Victorian romance. Ah yes, courtship, that choreographed dance of longing, constraint, and a steady stream of chaperones who hover like security drones. No lingering gazes are truly private in this world. You're not simply searching for love, you're auditioning for public approval, while pretending you aren't auditioning at all. Picture yourself at a genteel garden party. The grass is neatly clipped, ladies' parasols spread wide like pastel mushrooms, and gentlemen hover at a polite distance, waiting for the right moment to step forward. You spot someone across the lawn, your heart tingling as romance tries to sneak in. But beware, get too close, speak too long, laugh a little too loudly, and suddenly suspicion drizzles over you like unwanted rain. Victory in this game depends on balance. Express enough interest to be noticed, but not enough to scandalize an audience. Enter the dreaded or adored chaperone. Always present, always vigilant, she sits like a watchtower over the affair. Often a mother, aunt, or older family friend, she ensures conversations stay decorous, touches remain non-existent, and impropriety doesn't even get the chance to flutter its wings. Think of her as the Victorian version of a CCTV camera, except with sharper disapprovals and a stronger perfume. You might try to exchange supple hand squeezes beneath the tablecloth, but trust me, her eyes will laser through the linen like Superman. Even letters, those seemingly private outlets, bow to rules. A gentleman may not write directly to a young lady unless permitted by her family. Messages often filter through mothers or brothers. When allowed, the letters themselves avoid too much heart-flutter language. Straightforward, idiomatic affection often appears restrained, safe, framed by propriety. Historians still argue whether this made romances colder, or in fact infused them with greater creativity. After all, nothing awakens the poetic impulse like needing to say, "I care about you," without sounding scandalized. Of course, not all connections were as rigid as this ideal suggests. In bustling cities and street corners, working-class romances bloomed in parks or pubs, away from wealthy eyes. A mill worker's stolen kiss at dusk, or a sailor's bold wink, didn't need formal approval. Social rules stretched when survival forced them to. One person's scandal is another person's freedom. Still, in the world you've stepped into, beneath chandeliers and gazebos, you must navigate the stricter version. One quirky tidbit, half tragic and half comic. Some ladies would drop a handkerchief accidentally to signal interest. A gentleman was expected to notice, retrieve it gracefully, and hand it back with subtle charm. Yet if the gentleman wasn't sonnet material, or worse, if the handkerchief landed in front of the wrong fellow, disaster! Poor Harriet or Elizabeth could spend weeks undoing the rumour spawned from her misguided laundry drop. Victorian flirting, basically, required prop management skills worthy of a Broadway production. You glance around the garden. You watch how others behave to gather cues. The talented flirts manage with faint eyebrow arches, slight fan flicks, or polished bows. Was that nod a declaration of eternal devotion, or just pollen making her sneeze? Sometimes even historians laugh at how overstuffed with signals these encounters supposedly were. Did every lady really code elaborate emotional telegrams with her fan? Or was that just Victorian etiquette writers trying to make everyone paranoid so their books sold more copies? Historians still argue whether fan language was ever truly employed widely, or just a delicious myth. Still, there's no doubting the framework. Courtships are heavily supervised, measured, and hemmed in at the end of each polite encounter. The gentleman may request permission of the lady's father for more formal visits. Rejection doesn't occur bluntly. Instead, the young woman becomes mysteriously not at home whenever he calls. People understood the euphemism immediately. Ghosting existed well before text messaging, only here servants delivered the cold shoulder for you. Social rank carved an equally heavy role. A wealthy industrialist might wish to court an aristocratic young woman, but unless his fortune was dazzling enough to outshine his low birth, he'd face obstacles thicker than any fog. Conversely, many parents turned a blind eye to little sparks of love in favour of beneficial matches. Your heart aches for Jane, who loves the quiet clerk. But alas, the clerk's salary doesn't include status, and she finds herself steered toward the dull but titled landowner with questionable breath. Some historians argue this shows Victorian relationships as transactional. Others point out that genuine love stories absolutely flourished inside and outside the constraints. As with many things in this era, ideals clash noisily with realities. A particularly mainstream practice, the at-home day. Ladies would announce days they'd be available to receive visits. A gentleman calling on such a day was perfectly proper, observed under the gaze of watchful family, while calling unscheduled hinted at excessive interest, or worse, desperation. Scheduling romance like a hair appointment may sound awkward, but in the Victorian world, predictability meant dignity. It wasn't all tension, though. Picture dance halls glittering with chandeliers. Young couples waltz in careful embrace, gloves preventing direct skin contact. Feet move in prescribed patterns, music swells, and for one brief evening, romance breathes within structured boundaries. That waltz may provide more electricity than any modern date's candle-lit dinner, precisely because the rules starve the participants of anything less formal. When you've been restricted to polite handshakes for months, simply sharing a glide across the dance floor feels like a love sonnet. Yet even with passion muffled, rules breaking occasionally exploded into scandals. Elopements, running off suddenly to marry without permission, did occur. Gossip papers feasted on them, splashing names across columns with delight. The consequences could be dire. Families disowned daughters, reputations imploded, suitors faced social exile. And still, the drama lured onlookers like moths to flame. So whenever your innocent glances linger just a hair beyond etiquette's allowance, remember, you're playing with a fire Victorians both feared and secretly adored. You take one last look across the picnic lawn, your heartbeat quickening as parasol tips dab in the breeze and waistcoats gleam under a hesitant sun. Courtship here is not a private affair. It's a theatre, with your family, your peers, and your society as the audience. And whether you fumble your fan signal, drop a handkerchief to the wrong boot, or muster courage to petition a father, one thing remains constant. Romance in the Victorian era was never truly between two hearts alone. It was between those hearts, their families, the neighbours, the butler, and possibly even the family parrot. The fiddles and waltzes of last night's chaperoned courtship still hum faintly in your mind as you shift into another daily performance. Schooling. Whether you're an eager child or a yawning adolescent in Victorian Britain, your education doesn't simply fill your head with arithmetic and history. It molds your manners, discipline, and moral bearings like clay pressed in a very unyielding mould. You sit straighter, just imagining it. Because posture itself is half your grade here, the schoolroom is often stark. Desks lined up like soldiers, black slates and chalk at the ready. A teacher's desk looming with that almost mythical authority. The air smells faintly of chalk dust and ink, with an undercurrent of damp wall coats drying too slowly. A stern figure enters, whether it's the local schoolmaster in working-class districts or a private tutor in a middle-class parlour, and you immediately feel the room clench. The day is about to begin, and it will not include any TikTok breaks. You grip your slate and stylus. Lessons start early with reading and writing. Endless drills of the alphabet, phonics, spelling lists. Arithmetic drills come next, a mental boot camp of multiplication shouted aloud in unison. Children recite with a chorus of voices, almost chanting, as the teacher paces to ensure no mumble goes unheard. Actual silence isn't as prized as unison discipline, a reminder that you're part of a collective. Individual flair? Save that for Shakespeare recitations later, if you dare. A mainstream historical fact. Victorian education emphasized rote memorization above critical debate. Reciting entire passages of poetry or scripture, word for word, wasn't about enjoyment. It showed obedience, mental stamina, and reverence. A boy who could stand without shaking while declaiming biblical verses was applauded as respectable. A girl who wrote out flawless, substance mattered less than polish. Consistency mattered more than curiosity. Of course, corporal punishment shows its shadow here. That dreaded cane or ruler rests near the teacher's hand. Forget your verse, botch arithmetic, or whisper during prayers, and a stinging reminder swoops down. The Victorian philosophy, discipline now prevents ruin later. Historians still argue whether the severity of this punishment was universally accepted or more a caricature from later memory. Certainly, memoirs abound with tales of sore palms and rattling knuckles. Though defenders of the era claimed such discipline built character, an entire generation lived semi-fearful of chairs with squeaky legs that heralded teachers' approach. In wealthier homes, girls learned sewing, embroidery, piano, and French phrases, skills meant to sit prettily beside their future dowries. Boys were drilled in Latin, mathematics, and sometimes basics of history to prepare for university or clerical jobs. Yet again, those gender lines prove harder than slates. The very subjects you learn whisper about your future life trajectory. A boy reading Caesar, clearly destined for law or politics. A girl practicing needlepoint, clearly destined for the sphere of home. Education thus functioned less as a tool for independent discovery and more as a loudspeaker for class and gender expectations. But don't think the schoolroom was all grim. There were quirks too. Some teachers, eccentric as they come, made lessons memorable. Quirky tidbit, one famed Scottish tutor in the 1860s supposedly insisted on teaching geography by walking his students around town blindfolded. Slightly questionable as pedagogy, but you can't deny the creativity. The children likely cherished a break from slates, at least until they tripped over a lamppost. Books themselves carried worlds of fascination. Those lucky enough to possess a MacGuffey reader or similar moral text absorbed tales crammed with virtue, vices punished, honesty rewarded. Every fable reinforced the Victorian moral compass. Think work hard, stay humble, fear God. Libraries slowly opened more widely in the latter half of the century, sparking real curiosity among hungry readers. This was the age where, even beneath stern rules, ideas began seeping in, stirring a new awareness that wasn't always welcome by authority. At playtime, the mask slipped slightly. You dash into yards strewn with mud or gravel, tossing hoops, skipping ropes, or wrestling under the watchful eye of monitors. Even here, play is considered training. Boys are encouraged to be sturdy, competitive, and resilient. Girls, delicate, graceful, and contained. Still, laughter bursts forth, like fizz escaping a shaken bottle. For all the restricted decorum, children never stop finding mischief, chalking caricatures of the schoolmaster, swapping comic ballads, sneaking sweets under desks. Evidence shows children were never passive recipients. They fought boredom with a spirit that still feels familiar today. Schools aren't identical across class lines. In rural parishes, the local squire or church often funds a single-room building where children of mixed ages huddle together. Industrial cities sprout ragged schools, charitable ventures aiming to provide even the poorest with basic literacy. Though conditions are rough, cold rooms, ragged clothing, meagre lunches. Some working-class kids finish long hours in factories before arriving, half nodding to lessons. Historians still argue whether the spread of such schooling lifted communities or merely pacified them with minimal education. Was it social justice or social control? The debate lingers like chalk dust. Meanwhile, upper-class boys attend prestigious boarding institutions like Eton or Harrow. These schools pride themselves on turning boys into future leaders, complete with Latin drills, cricket matches, and a strong dose of hazing disguised as tradition. The ethos is muscular Christianity. Build both body and soul tough enough to rule empires. In contrast, upper-class women were often tutored at home with governesses who straddled the uncanny line of being both part of the household and socially outside of it. Governesses often lived isolated lives, respected yet lonely, strict yet compassionate. One unusual yet telling detail: copybooks. Every student's handwriting was supposed to mimic models provided in slanted, neat scripts. The act of writing beautifully transcended mere aesthetics. It screamed good character. A sloppy hand was considered a sloppy soul. Imagine being judged eternally because your pea curls drooped one morning after breakfast. One wonders how many children cried over looped letters while their teachers muttered endlessly about discipline. By the day's end, you're emotionally drained, mind buzzing with memorized poetry, Latin conjugations, and the sting of rigid rules. Yet you've also absorbed something subtler, an entire worldview woven into your lessons. Authority is supreme. Morality is absolute. The future is determined by role, by rank, by station. And yet every whispered joke across benches, every stolen doodle, every secret grin betrays the undercurrent of young humanity refusing to be fully caged. As you trudge home, chalk smudges on your sleeves, you realize school here isn't just about learning. It's dress rehearsal for the broader show of Victorian life. Discipline, obedience, polish, piety. Still, amid the sternness and knuckle raps, imagination sneaks out the cracks. For every child who recited endless verses without passion, another quietly dreamed bigger, scribbling stories, humming tunes, or imagining worlds beyond the timetable. And that stubborn will, that timeless refusal to let rules crush curiosity, is the reason you and I can still hear their voices echo today, long after the chalkboards were wiped clean. You've survived the recitations, the memorized verses, and the ink-blotted copybooks of morning lessons, and now, depending on who you are and what station you hold, you step into the larger, smokier theatre of Victorian work. This is where the rhythms of factories, offices, docks, and counting houses grind ceaselessly. It's where hard work isn't mere virtue, it's survival currency. Your collar itches, your back aches, and yet society insists you call it duty. Imagine the clang of factory bells, sharp, metallic reminders that you are late, and lateness is moral failure. The streets swarm with workers, funneling like ants into brick leviathans. Textile mills, steel foundries, shipyards choking with the smell of tar. Inside, the noise is deafening. Looms thunder, belts whip, gears grind. You're standing in a modern cathedral of labour. Except instead of hymns, the air vibrates with machinery's relentless sermon. If you're one of these mill hands, your shift will stretch 10, sometimes 12 or 14 hours. Fingers must move quickly, weaving, sewing, hauling. For children, nimble hands thread bobbins where adult hands won't fit. Everyone learns the hard way. Blink too long or let fatigue slacken vigilance, and you risk more than disapproval. You risk your limb. A mainstream fact. By the mid-1800s, Parliament introduced factory acts to curb child labour and limit hours. Yet the enforcement was uneven, and abuses thrived where inspectors seldom trod. Elsewhere, clerks line up in stuffy counting houses, quills scratching, ledgers absorbing their ink like ravenous beasts. Your job description? Copy, calculate, transpose, repeat. Daylight drains into numbers. To be a clerk is to bet your whole life on careful pen strokes, never smudging. Weariness is cloaked in respectability, since a seat indoors suggests advancement. Still, your lungs beg for air after hours inhaling oil lamps and damp plaster. Historians still argue whether the expansion of clerical jobs truly democratized mobility, or whether it merely trapped men in new forms of white-collar monotony. On the docks, the mood contrasts. Men haul cargo, crates thump, ships creak, salt stings your nose. With each swell of the tide, cash flows in or vanishes. Dockers' work is unstable, controlled by those who hire labourers on the spot, what became known as the call-on. You wait, you hook, you carry, and tomorrow you might be jobless again. Here, time isn't neatly measured by office clocks, but by tides, weather, and demand. For respectable women of the middle classes, work theoretically doesn't exist outside the home. The home is her sanctum, her kingdom, her proof of influence. She's expected to orchestrate cleanliness, staff, childcare, all unpaid labour disguised as moral elevation. The paradox stings. No wages, yet immense responsibility. To fail at home management invites gossip that can cripple a family's rank. Domestic labour remains invisible, unmonetized, and yet totally central. For working-class women, however, wages are unavoidable. They crowd into factories alongside men, scrub the laundry of strangers, sell in markets, or undertake seamstress work that gnaws at eyesight, while sending coins trickling into family purses. Many women took pride in the dignity of labour, yet battled exhaustion and societal scorn for leaving the home sphere. One quirky tidbit: a popular trade for women was making artificial flowers from feathers and dyed papers. These delicate blossoms adorned hats across Britain, though for the women who made them, the dyes sometimes triggered slow poisoning. Imagine inhaling arsenic fumes daily, just so someone else's bonnet could bloom prettily. Work shapes time itself differently here. The town clock isn't decoration. It's the heartbeat of obligation. Bells summon, whistles release, but almost no moment belongs to you. Lunch in a factory might be eaten quickly amidst roaring looms. In an office, lunch is an absent concept entirely. And even when hours finally expire, fatigue clings so heavily that leisure is often nothing more than collapsing onto straw mattresses or stiff horsehair sofas. And yet, paradoxically, the very starkness of work settings became seeds of community. In mills, women sang snatches of songs above machinery noise. Clerks exchanged office banter to soften monotony. Dockers organised for rights, forming early unions. The fight for better pay, fewer hours, safer workplaces simmered here, long before other reforms took hold. Historians still argue whether workers of this time were deeply oppressed passives or vital agents in shaping modern labour movements. Perhaps both, depending on the day and on how badly your knuckles ached. The clash of class becomes obvious too. A wealthy industrialist might stroll the floor in a tailcoat, observing the labour his fortune depends on, while the workers toil in sweat-stained clothes. Each side inhabits the same building, but lives on entirely different planets. This hierarchy is simultaneously glaring and normalized. Everyone accepts it as the order of things, or at least publicly pretends to. Of course, not all workplaces are bleak. Imagine the innovation bubbling inside some offices. Patent clerks dreaming of wild inventions, railroad planners mapping faster routes, artists sketching pamphlets. One fringe career, the mudlark, usually children scouring riverbanks to recover coal, nails, or lost trinkets washed up in the Thames. Barefoot, filthy, sometimes triumphant, mudlarks survive quite literally on society's scraps. Their peculiar work reveals just how resourceful people became, that coaxing a living out of unforgiving landscapes. But mostly, your day means endurance. The smell of oil thickens the air. Your throat dries from dust or ink. Your head pounds with numbers, looms or hammers. And yet, when the shift ends, you straighten your back, brush ash or chalk from your sleeves, and step outside. Sunset smears the sky, yet tomorrow promises the same grind. You reflect. To live here is to organize your very body around work's demands. Posture, breath, clothes. And so, when you return home, lungs still tickled by coal or salt, you carry with you more than wages. You carry stories, frustrations, sparks of determination. The workplace of Victorian Britain drains you, but it also slowly builds the muscles of society's future. The push toward worker protection, women's agency, and humane hours, all born in the endurance of millions like you, who woke to the bell and trudged on, day after day. You stumble back from the din of factories and the scratch of ledgers, only to find yourself walking up the steps of a fine house, or perhaps slipping round the corner through the tradesman's entrance, depending on which side of the social coin you've landed. Because now, the script turns indoors, behind those curtained windows where bells, polished brass, and whispered orders sustain the secret machinery of middle and upper class households. The servant's world. Picture a grand home. High ceilings echoing faintly, marble fireplaces gleaming, carpets so lush your shoes practically drown in them. The air smells faintly of beeswax polish and coal smoke. And yet, while guests admire the lilies arranged in crystal vases, they rarely glimpse the army making such arrangements possible. Below stairs, it's another reality. Narrow servants' corridors, stone kitchens clanging with copper pots, and bedrooms so cramped even a mouse would feel claustrophobic. Two worlds exist beneath one roof, folded together by ritual, habit, and hierarchy. At the heart of it all, the servants' bell system. Each room is rigged with a little cord that runs to a brass plate downstairs, where bells line a frame on the wall. When someone upstairs tugs, a bell downstairs jingles sharply, springing a servant to their feet. Some households sported dozens of these brass tongues, each labelled morning room, withdrawing room, nursery. Imagine living your whole life waiting for a little bell to boss you. That ding could call you to pour tea, stoke a fire, polish another boot, or at worst, carry out tasks your employers could not be bothered to describe politely. Mainstream fact: in many upper-class Victorian homes, The servant hierarchy was strict as military order. At the top, the butler and housekeeper, commanders of this domestic battalion. Below them, footmen in livery, valets attentive to their gentlemen, ladies' maids fussing over gowns, cooks ruling the kitchen like sovereigns, scullery maids endlessly scrubbing pots. Each role had coded expectations, down to how loudly you knocked on a door, or whether you looked a master in the eye. The peculiar paradox: masters depended on servants utterly, and yet preferred to act as though servants were invisible. A drawing room's perfect calm relied on a dozen hands soldering order silently behind doors. Appearances meant everything after all. As the saying went, the mark of good servants is that you never see them. Comfort was conjured like magic, its magicians hidden beneath the stage. Here's your quirky tidbit of the evening. Households sometimes competed to parade footmen like prize ponies. Tall, handsome young men with calves shining in silk stockings and gleaming brass buttons were status symbols. Having one enter to announce your guests elevated your house as much as any chandelier. Some families even recruited footmen based on exact measurements, as if ordering luxury furniture. The job description included height, along with sobriety and honesty. It was less help wanted and more fashion model with tray skills apply here. But while some positions carried dignity, others lived at the edge of exploitation. Scullery maids, typically young girls, worked before dawn, scraping pots, fetching water, emptying ash, jobs as endless as they were thankless. Laundry maids soaked linens in boiling lye until their hands cracked. Indoor plumbing was still rare, so hauling chamber pots constituted a daily routine, and I assure you, no one wrote etiquette manuals about that maneuver. Historians still debate how much resentment and tension ran through these households. Were servants resigned, grateful for employment, even loyal to their good masters? Or was every crisp bow delivered through clenched teeth, with muttered curses traded down below stairs? Evidence clutters both sides. Diaries reveal deep affection in some households, bitterness in others. Likely, it was a patchwork mosaic. Affection here, rage there, endurance everywhere. And gossip. Oh, the gossip. Servants were the unacknowledged ears and eyes of the house. Conversations overheard while pouring wine or tidying drawing rooms could trickle into networks below stairs, then ripple into entire neighborhoods. Servants knew all, saw all, and although they risked dismissal for loose tongues, stories nevertheless travelled. Your reputation could fracture, thanks not only to formal scandals, but because cook muttered something sharp to a grocer, who passed it to a neighbour, who delighted in whispering it over tea. Privacy? A charming fantasy. Daily schedules defined lives tightly. A housemaid rises before dawn, lighting fires in chilly rooms, so that by the time the master descends, yawning in robe and slippers, the house already hums with comfortable warmth. A valet lays out his master's clothes, ensures the shirt is pressed so impeccable that no crease suggests laziness. The mistress consults her housekeeper on supplies, who relays to the cook, who sketches a day's menu, who then wrangles scullery maids. And so on. It's a machine, large, squeaky, full of quirks, but humming with discipline. The below-stairs life also forged camaraderie. After exhausting dawn to midnight shifts, servants tucked into modest suppers together, swapping jokes, singing tunes, poking fun at masters' foibles safe from their ears. Kindness flourished in these hidden hours, alongside rivalry and occasional romance. Servants lived too close for walls not to shake, with both laughter and quarrels. Their society mimicked in miniature the stratification upstairs. Junior maids deferring to cooks, cooks bowing to housekeepers. But even within duty, a pulse of humanity vibrated, warm beneath the cold brass discipline, and sometimes boundaries collapsed. A child of the house might form lifelong bonds with their nursemaid, greater than with their own parents. Ladies' maids often knew secrets about mistresses' private lives that husbands never suspected. Master and valet sometimes developed quiet companionship beyond simply buttoning coats. These relationships blurred the rigidity of downstairs. You live invisible, yet essential. And in every corner of the house, from the grand chandeliered dining room to the coal dust kitchens, the relentless machinery of duty ticks on. And as you drift a little in thought, you realize the Victorian household is less a home than a miniature kingdom. Its rulers march, its subjects serve, its bells dictate laws, and its walls whisper secrets. Whether you walk upstairs or below, you cannot escape the hierarchy. You might not even escape the smell of boiled cabbage drifting from kitchens. But this too is life in a society where even the hearth burns with rules. You leave the servants shuffling beneath the weight of brass bells and polished buttons, and step once again into your own garments, which, as any Victorian would remind you, are neither casual choices nor mere fabrics. Clothing here is a uniform of class, gender, and respectability, stitched together so tightly you could choke on a sleeve seam. Fashion is not self-expression. Heaven forbid originality sneak in. Instead, it is a flashing neon sign of who you are, where you belong, how much you earn, and whether you respect the unwritten rules everyone else pretends are rational. Start with the corset. Yes, that notorious garment that squeezes your torso until your lungs write petitions of despair. To be properly laced is not optional for women. It is compulsory. The whalebone or steel stays cinch your waist, force your posture upright, and create that idealized hourglass figure admired in parlors and caricatured in satire. Breathing deeply, a lost luxury. Laughing fully, dangerous. Running? Ha! You topple like a domino. Yet if you appear uncorseted, tongues wag, unkempt, unfeminine, maybe even scandalous. The corset is both prison and passport. Then comes the crinoline, wide hoop skirts that transform women into floating bell towers. Step through a doorway and you risk knocking over a vase, brushing candles, or sweeping someone's teacup away with your hem. Practicality takes the day off. Aesthetics runs the show. Mainstream fact, by the mid-19th century, crinolines were so wide they caused accidental fires when women brushed against open grates or oil lamps. Newspapers described tragic blazes with morbid frequency. Yet society pushed silhouettes wider and wider, as though your personal circumference directly measured your respectability. One quirky tidbit even veers into the absurd. Some practical jokers wrote pamphlets lampooning crinolines, claiming women could smuggle full picnic baskets beneath their skirts. Imagine being accused of hiding your lunch, or worse, another person, under layers of muslin. The point still hits. Society ridiculed what it simultaneously demanded, leaving women bound, both literally and figuratively, by impossibly contradictory standards. And what of men? Don't think for a second they had ease. Tailcoats so stiff they could stand unaided, collars so sharply starched you risk slicing your jawline with them. Trousers, waistcoats, gloves, silk hats. Dandies strutted the streets with polished boots that gleamed like mirrors, silver-topped canes in hand, challenging one another in silent fashion duels. To appear sloppy in public was an assault on your family's good name. If your bowler tilted too far or your trousers bagged at the knee, you risked branding yourself idle or vulgar. And hats. Oh, the hats. A woman's bonnet was practically a billboard. Ribbons, feathers, veils, even taxidermy creatures perched on some heads. By the 1880s, entire dead birds became the unfortunate victims of millinery art. Historians still argue whether this extravagance reflected exuberant self-expression or was merely another grim proof of consumer excess. Either way, imagine sitting in a pew at church, stiffly craning to see the priest past several sparrow corpses mounted on your neighbour's head. Spiritual focus? Impossible. Shoes, in turn, symbolised rank. Wealthier women sported delicate satin slippers that never touched mud, thanks to carriages and paved walks. Working-class folks stomped in boots sturdy enough to survive horse muck, coal dust, and factory floors. The difference screamed class louder than any introduction. Clothes, more than speech or education, stamped a person instantly. Before they could utter a single syllable, your eyes had judged them by cut, fabric, and polish. Even accessories carried moral weight. Gloves, for instance, weren't just warm, they signalled gentility. No glove, no class. To shake hands bare-skinned was practically indecent, except in private, with intimates. Umbrellas, parasols, walking sticks, all announced subtle codes beyond their function. Walking stick too ornate? You risked flaunting. Umbrella too battered? You risked mockery louder than the rain itself. The time required to maintain these appearances devoured mornings. Ladies' maids brushed, powdered, and pinned. Valets oiled boots, pressed coats, and ensured their masters looked like statues of virtue. To dress for dinner in wealthier households was not indulgence, but obligation, even if you weren't leaving home. Appearances fed the cult of respectability, and your wardrobe was as binding as scripture. Historians still argue whether fashion was liberating, for offering a way into society's graces, or crushing, because it trapped identity under suffocating rules. Perhaps both truths stitched together. After all, one could step onto a boulevard, beautifully turned out, and command respect otherwise denied by birth. Yet at the same time, you slaved under scissors, starch, and corsetry just to maintain that illusion. And fashion never simply stood still. By late century, silhouettes shrank, bustles sprouted, and trousers slimmed. Periodicals trumpeted new cuts with evangelical zeal. Satirical magazines mocked each era's trends, only for those very comic shapes to become tomorrow's norm. An ongoing seesaw. Exaggerate, ridicule, adopt, repeat. Much as today, where jeans ripped on purpose mystify one generation and enthrall another. Notice too how fashion encoded moral lessons. Black attire proclaimed mourning. The stricter the widow's garb, the more virtuous her grief. White dresses whispered innocence. Gender, virtue, even patriotism clothed themselves in cloth. Your hemline said more than your diary ever could. What you wore was not self, but sermon. And for the poor, their wardrobes, patched, mended, cobbled, rarely followed trends. Yet even they yearned to polish boots for Sunday best. A new ribbon or clean collar was effort enough and meaningful in pride. Respectability's dream haunted every class, not just the wealthy. Even second-hand markets thrived, trading last season's gowns and coats, so that factory girls might strut on a rare evening, hair ribboned, heart lifted. You sit now, picturing yourself in layers of wool and silk, hat balanced precariously, corset whispering threats, or collar pinching your jugular. It isn't simply what shall I wear. In Victorian Britain, clothing is destiny. To dress wrong is to be mocked. To dress correctly is to survive, be respected, or maybe even adored. But not for your personality. Heavens, that might never be known. Only for the shape of your waist, the gleam of your boots, the dignity of your gloves. So, tomorrow, as bells toll and parlours open, you'll button, lace, tug, and smooth once again. Each seam stitched into your performance, each ribbon more than an ornament, each corset string another reminder. Fashion here is no afterthought. It is the costume binding you to this immense, exhausting play of Victorian life. A play you can never step off stage from, even in your dreams. You tuck off the hat with its precarious feathered passenger and loosen the corset strings. Just a little, enough to breathe without swooning. And you realize something. The pressure outside your own house doesn't stop at calling cards, table manners, or fashion. It seeps straight into your conscience. That invisible hand pressing on your chest right now, that's religion, or at least the Victorian version of it, whispering rules into every corner of the day. On Sunday morning, the city slows. Church bells toll across every district, from ivy-draped parish spires in the countryside to soot-stained chapels hugging grimy London streets. Attending service isn't just piety, it's respectability. The walk to church itself is a parade. Families arrayed in stiff Sunday best, bonnets and gloves pristine, as if God might peer first at your shoes before listening to your prayers. To stay home risks whispers. Is she ill? Or worse, irreligious? Inside the church, the air swirls with wax candles, coal smoke clinging to wool coats, and the musty scent of hymnals handled by generations. Sermons stretch long, steady, measured in cadences meant to pierce your moral fibre. Mainstream fact. In many communities, the local vicar or minister wasn't just a pastor. He was the moral referee, family counsellor, and sometimes the unofficial judge of disputes. A good word from him could accelerate your rise in local society. A frown could dent your standing. Children squirm in pews, their energy colliding with the stern requirement of stillness. You too suppress yawns. After all, the Victorian sermon could drone on for a solid hour. But everyone must sit upright, hymnals held high, voices singing not too loud, not too soft, just properly devout. If you think entire pews weren't policing one another's singing volume, you underestimate Victorian commitment to judgment. Religion here, though, is more than Sunday. It perforates the entire week. Charity, motivated by biblical duty. Work, cast as godly discipline. Even leisure is couched in moral improvement. Taverns and gambling dens are blamed for eroding spiritual health, while temperance societies gather with tea and pamphlets, wagging fingers at the evils of gin. The campaign against drink was a powerhouse movement. Its rhetoric so fiery that even a modest glass of sherry could earn side-eye glances depending on your company. Religious tracts clog bookshops and doorsteps. Imagine hundreds of pamphlets fluttering through parlours, warning about dancing, frivolous novels, or the spiritual doom guaranteed by playing cards. A quirky tidbit: one pamphlet railed not just against alcohol, but against wearing brightly coloured socks, declaring scarlet hosiery was proof of moral corruption. Imagine damning your soul via footwear. It tells you everything about how the late Victorians sometimes lost themselves in the silliest details while claiming to police eternity. And yet, contradictions abound. Industrialization and science crept steadily into daily life. Charles Darwin dropped his little bombshell in the 1850s, sketching an evolutionary world divorced from biblical timelines. The reaction? Explosive, divisive, fascinating. Historians still argue whether the average Victorian was truly shaken by the theory of evolution, or whether it mostly ruffled elites and scholars. God, etiquette, and textile merchants formed an unlikely trinity guiding your tears. For some, faith became activism. The Salvation Army emerged in the 1860s, sending brassy bands marching through dismal districts, offering soup and scripture in equal measure. Their energy jolted communities locked in cycles of misery and gin. Meanwhile, reformers blended faith with social progress. Abolition earlier in the century, later movements for slum reform, education. Women's rights. Belief wasn't merely internal piety. It crackled with external reach. God, etiquette, and textile merchants formed an unlikely trinity guiding your tears. For some, faith became activism. The Salvation Army emerged in the 1860s, sending brassy bands marching through dismal districts, offering soup and scripture in equal measure. Their energy jolted communities locked in cycles of misery and gin. Meanwhile, reformers blended faith with social progress. Abolition earlier in the century, later movements for slum reform, education, women's rights. Belief wasn't merely internal piety. It crackled with external reach. But naturally, hypocrisy festered too. Wealthy patrons donated money for new chapels, yet underpaid servants. Men boasted about piety by day, while creeping into less reputable clubs by night. Gossip hung as thick as incense in the air. The rules were followed, broken, retold, exaggerated. A bishop might thunder against dancing in a sermon, only for his niece to twirl at a ball that very evening. Humans remain stubbornly human, no matter how many sermons are preached. One last cheeky reminder. Religion also shaped how you even spent Sundays outside church. For many, riding trains, attending theatres, even playing cricket on the Sabbath prompted disapproval. Sabbatarian campaigns aimed to enforce blanket restrictions. Shut shops, quiet amusements, still the world. Historians still argue whether this strictness stemmed from sincere reverence or from an almost obsessive Victorian craving for orderliness. In any case, It meant your hopes of sneaking to the pub after church might well be dashed. And so here you sit, hymn echoes still reverberating in your ear, stomach aching ever so slightly from soup too carefully sipped last night, and you feel religion not just as spirituality, but as weight, sometimes inspiring, sometimes suffocating, always pervasive. It wraps around you like incense smoke, clings to your clothes like coal dust, and tells you how to live, how to think, even how to mourn. It shapes both your Sundays and your Tuesdays, your joys and your shames. It makes sure that even in a society obsessed with appearance, morality stands as the stage manager behind the curtains, pulling strings on your wardrobe, your wine glass, your etiquette, and your prayers alike. Your hymnal is tucked back on its shelf. Your gloves smell faintly of incense, and the echo of the sermon still thumps in the back chambers of your conscience. But it's evening now, and duty loosens just a little. Social life beckons, if only within its rigid boundaries. This is the part of Victorian existence everybody imagines as balls, promenades, and soirees. But let's not kid ourselves. The fun is heavily supervised fun. Yes, my friend, welcome to leisure by the rulebook. You step into a drawing room glittering with chandeliers. Candles reflect in glassware. A piano waits in the corner, an instrument positioned not for its sound, but for its symbolic value, refinement, morality, culture. Someone clears their throat and launches into a Chopin piece. Everyone nods approvingly, though half the crowd is frankly trying not to doze after roast beef. This is an evening at home, not a rager. Nobody's cannonballing into punch bowls. Instead, you politely applaud while praying the amateur soprano finishes her warbling before your ears wilt. But you can't complain too loudly. Leisure underpins social bonds. A mainstream fact: in Victorian society, leisure activities, ballrooms, theatres, seaside getaways, were all structured to reflect class boundaries. You may dance, promenade, or ride, but only among those of your rank, only in prescribed ways. Everyone played, but they played hierarchically. Even fun obeys a caste system. Take dancing, for instance. The waltz appears scandalous at first. Imagine a man's arm fully around a woman's waist. By mid-century, however, it becomes the cornerstone of respectable events. But rules remain, steps rehearsed, lengths of dances assigned, partners carefully chosen. Your program card lists each dance, and failing to fill it is a public embarrassment. Whispered panic sets in if you land too many spares. Romance glimmers in these waltzes, yes, but the choreography is less spontaneous passion and more polite job fare. When company tires of music and dancing, conversation reigns. But remember, the same rules from the dinner table carry over. No politics too strongly expressed, no money brags, and for heaven's sake, steer clear of medical details unless you want to watch monocles pop. Acceptable subjects: poetry, travel, novels, charitable gossip. And yes, allow a sprinkle of scandal. If delicately delivered, scandal entertains rather than condemns. Of course, not all leisure takes place indoors. Step into Hyde Park on a sunny afternoon and behold, the promenade. It is technically just walking, but Victorians elevate it into theatre. Carriages circle the Serpentine. Ladies flutter parasols, gentlemen tip hats, and everyone gazes discreetly at everyone else. This is social networking before smartphones. If your dress impresses, if your companion flatters, if your carriage looks elegant, opportunities bloom. If not, well, you become background scenery. Another anonymous stroller. One quirky tidbit: seaside resorts exploded during this period, and with them came bathing machines. Wooden carts rolled into the water so bathers could change inside, then step discreetly into the sea unseen. The idea of simply running into waves half-dressed was horrifying. Respectability required protecting public innocence from the horrifying spectacle of ankles. Imagine enjoying salty. Of course, critics sniff about morality. Was theatre corrupting? Historians still argue whether the explosion of entertainments reflected cultural loosening, or whether moralists fiercely policed even playhouses. Reality suggests both. Theatres thrived, but codes of appropriate attendance and strict seating sections by class reminded everyone this was still Victorian Britain, not a free-for-all. Leisure sometimes blurred into charity. Think of tea meetings, bazaars, and lectures where you were there to be seen and to demonstrate piety or civic duty. Social life wasn't just about fun. It was about proving yourself reputable, charitable, proper. Even your board games smuggled moral lessons. Children's toys and puzzles taught biblical verses more often than not. Monopoly may encourage greed. Victorian toys encouraged patience, thrift, or eternal vigilance against sin. Yea, and yet, for the working classes, leisure carried different flavours. Music halls brimmed with comic songs, dance numbers, acrobats, bawdy humour. Still PG-13, mind you, but scandalous to upper lips. For a penny or two, you could escape factory clangour, laugh with neighbours, and sip ale beyond the gaze of vicar or foreman. Aristocrats looked down their noses, but music halls gave working folk what they needed: release. Historians debate, was this empowerment, workers shaping their cultural sphere, or simple escapism spoon-fed by industrial overlords? Either way, audiences roared, stamping rhythm into wooden floors, loud enough to drown debates upstairs. We might as well laugh at the strictness too. Joke alert number 1. Imagine longing to enjoy the beach while some stern matron insists on guarding your calves like they're state secrets. Joke alert number 2. Attending a soiree so polite that you risk scandal by sneezing too loudly. Joke alert number 3. Buying a ticket to a theatre balcony, only to realise the gossip about you in row 3 is more dramatic than the actors on stage. Fun, Victorian style. And here's the thing, whether promenading or sitting half-tracked in a crinoline through yet another amateur recital, leisure is where Victorian social life blooms. It is both comfort and cage. These rules remind you always, never too loud, never too boisterous, never too free. Relaxation only exists as long as propriety bows alongside it. So you sip your weak lemonade, fold your dance card with careful fingers, and drape your shawl tighter in the evening breeze. Entertainment ticked its boxes tonight: sophistication, charm, propriety. Not relaxation, perhaps, but continuity. You have performed leisure as well as you performed work, prayer, or dinner etiquette. And tomorrow, this careful waltz starts again. Inside parlours, through music halls, along seaside promenades. Each step a reminder that in the Victorian stage play, even fun has cue cards. If your corset, crinolines, calling cards and church sermons have all felt exhausting, imagine stepping into the smallest shoes of this enormous stage, those of a Victorian child. And don't picture carefree romping through meadows for too long. Because while the idealized sentimental paintings loved to show angelic little girls with ribbons and rosy-cheeked boys with toy horses, the truth for most children was far sterner, more disciplined, sometimes downright punishing. Childhood here is rarely a free pass. It is an apprenticeship for adulthood, pressed into tiny forms. The house wakes you early, just as it does the adults. Children are expected to rise promptly, wash in chilly basins, dress in miniaturized versions of adult clothing, and appear obedient in the nursery or schoolroom. No tattered pajamas or messy hair. Every detail of dress reinforces the expectation that children should be little adults, seen, not heard, and above all, polite. The phrase, "children should be seen and not heard," summarizes much of society's outlook. Meals are lessons too. At the breakfast table, you chew deliberately, never fidget, certainly never announce hunger too loudly. One mainstream fact: Victorian parents believed strongly in instilling manners through daily repetition, so mealtimes doubled as training grounds. If little elbows wandered onto the table, you might expect a sharp rebuke or even a smack on the knuckles with a spoon. Nothing like eggs and etiquette for early morning character building. Afternoon means lessons. If you belonged to the middle or upper classes, the nursery was presided over by a nanny, then later a governess who rattled off French verbs and drilled you in handwriting. If you were a boy destined for further education, Latin declensions awaited like mischievous gremlins. If a girl, you memorized moral tales while perfecting embroidery until your fingers stiffened. Lower class children, meanwhile, balanced scraps of schooling with long hours at textile mills, mines, or hawking goods on streets. Historians still argue whether working children absorbed learning at ragged schools earnestly, or whether exhaustion left them unable to benefit. Most likely, it depended on how many hours were left in them after labour. Play existed. Yes, but carefully scripted. Indoor toys were didactic. Alphabet blocks, copybooks, puzzles plastered with moral proverbs. Toy soldiers promoted bravery. Dolls promoted domestic nurturing. Everything taught you how to inhabit your prescribed role. Think of childhood as play rehearsals for adulthood, with props provided. Even board games drilled lessons in thrift or honesty. No whimsical unicorn lands, but plenty of the game of virtue. Put simply, your fun came with a manual. Quirky tidbit: Victorian toy makers occasionally produced bizarre novelties. There was, for example, a doll that recited prayers when you pulled a hidden cord, her wooden lips squeaking out holy words. Imagine introducing your friends to a toy that prays louder than the vicar. Then again, It epitomizes how religion infused even leisure. Childhood toys doubled as spiritual training. Punishments for transgression loomed heavily. Spilled ink, immediate scolding. Possibly punishment. Crying too loudly, labeled spoiled. Sentimental novels about children expiring young often underlined the lesson that death itself was a moral teacher. An unsettling way, Victorians taught both children and adults that patience, sacrifice, and sincerity were life's noblest goals. And we thought reading bedtime stories with a villain was intense enough. A mainstream reality. Victorian society considered corporal punishment routine both at school and at home. The cane, birch rod, slipper or ruler kept order in classrooms and nurseries alike. Yet ironically, literature of the time adored ideal children. Docile, obedient, cherubic figures embodying virtue. Historians still argue whether this gap between the angelic child image and the beaten child reality indicates cultural hypocrisy or simply aspirational idealization. Either way, children themselves bore the brunt of it. Yet let's not assume only misery. Many middle-class children cherished afternoons in gardens, playing croquet, hoops, or hide-and-seek. Country dwellers scrambled in fields, catching beetles or climbing trees despite parental disapproval. And working-class children, when a pocket of freedom came, might join boisterous street games, chase hoops with sticks, or improvise joy with scraps and stones. The stubborn resilience of childhood bubbled everywhere. Stern rules couldn't totally cork youthful laughter. Religion also carved its path through miniature lives. Sunday school became one of the largest voluntary movements of the 19th century. Thousands of children filed into chapels each Sunday, not just for Bible instruction, but for precious literacy lessons. Some remembered Sunday schools fondly. Community, songs, learning letters. Others recalled endless sermons, dragging through their only day off. Again, contradiction is the Victorian hallmark. Benevolence braided with boredom. The concept of innocence began gaining real cultural weight. Writers like Dickens depicted child characters embodying purity, suffering unjustly under adults' cruelty. These fictional portrayals captured readers' hearts and reshaped cultural ideals. Yet the real lives of children still bore poverty, dangerous labor, and premature death from disease. The mortality rate remained soberingly high. Losing siblings young was normal, not exceptional. But in painting and prose, Victorians clung to the haloed idea of cherubic youngsters as emblems of hope. Another contradiction. While adults idealized silence and obedience, they also adored parlor entertainment, where children performed recitations or piano pieces for guests. So much for invisibility. When showtime came, you were dragged onto the miniature stage. Perfection was expected. Mistakes drawn out for laughter or correction. Childhood was not refuge. It was an evolving performance of adult goals. Quirky yet revealing detail. Punch and Judy puppet shows drew screaming, chaotic giggles from children in public parks, despite their violent slapstick humor. Adults fretted. Were such shows corrupting youth? Or were they harmless? Historians still argue whether puppet theatres represented social catharsis, children laughing at authority figures being whacked with sticks, or corrupted innocence. The fact that these debates occur at all tells you how thoroughly civilization tried to script even a child's laughter. Even bedtime turned into instruction. Prayers rehearsed, moral tales narrated. Stories carefully chosen to reinforce patience, honesty, sacrifice. Good night was never just a wish of peaceful sleep. It was one final attempt at shaping souls. Picture yourself tucked into stiff sheets under a nanny's strict eye, whispering your prayers obediently. Your candle is snuffed, your room dark. Silence becomes duty. Freedom waits outside, but seldom inside. Yet as you drift off, wiggles in your toes betray it. Children still found ways, scribbling secret notes, sneaking sweets, or giggling past bedtime. They followed bird calls into trees, scraped knees, invented new games out of nothing but imagination. Rules could constrain, but never kill delight. So yes, childhood in Victorian Britain was sternly guided, but not lifeless. Children did as children always do. They carved joy out of any opening, scattering echoes of laughter through parlour, classroom, or soot-lined alleyway. Your ears are still ringing with the squeaks of Punch's stick. Your belly is heavy from moralising puddings. And now, inevitably, your body begins to complain. Which is the perfect segue into one of the more bewildering aspects of 19th century existence: health and hygiene in Victorian Britain. Prepare yourself. In an age before reliable antibiotics, before effective sewage systems, and before toothbrushes as we know them, life's medical chapter is part comedy of errors, part tragedy, and part sheer endurance. Start in the home. You look into a basin where someone has poured grudgingly warmed water for a weekly bath. Yes, I said weekly. For most, daily showers are pure fantasy, unless you count being caught in a downpour. Upper-class households install great, hulking copper tubs and may even boast crude indoor plumbing by late century. But water is often scarce, expensive to heat, and heavy to haul. So, cleanliness is relative. Change of linen? Yes. Full immersion? Not so often. The doctrine that airing out clothing or brushing briskly counted as bathing kept noses tolerably comfortable. At least that's what the manuals insisted. Boil that same water too long and voila, your prescribed remedy. Indeed, mainstream fact, doctors and pamphlets loudly recommended water not only for washing, but also for regulating bodily humours. Cold baths at dawn were said to invigorate, toughen the spirit, and ward off melancholy. Imagine dousing yourself with icy buckets while coal smoke still hangs in the morning air. Refreshing in name, pneumonia-inducing in practice. And medicine, you ask? Stepping to a Victorian apothecary shop, shelves groaning with bottles, jars of translucent liquids, powders in paper packets. Remedies run the gamut from the tried and true to the fantastically bizarre. Calomel, mercury chloride, was dispensed liberally as a purgative. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was practically the Tylenol of the time. Toothache? Opiates. Cough? Opiates. Trouble sleeping? Opiates. Babies fussing? Yes. Dosing infants with soothing syrups packed with morphine was common practice. Calm baby, calm parents, until, well, less calm endings. Public health was little better than private. The mid-century Great Stink of London, when the Thames essentially became a flowing sewer, drowning Parliament itself in odour, finally spurred investment in sewage systems. In the meantime, cholera outbreaks ravaged work. One genuine breakthrough did come. Anesthesia entered operating theatres by the 1840s, drastically reducing patient trauma in surgeries. But don't grow too comfortable. Sterilisation lagged behind. Surgeons often wore the same blood-crusted garments proudly, calling them good luck coats. Historians still argue whether the reluctance to wash hands and instruments stemmed from ingrained theory or sheer stubbornness. Whatever the reason, an operation frequently solved one problem only to create many more courtesy of infection. Dentistry, hold your jaw. Tooth powders involving brick dust, chalk, or crushed cuttlebone were popular. Some advocated scrubbing teeth with salt or even soot. If decay advanced, extraction was the only cure, with pliers, minus anaesthetic until mid-century. Feel free to wince. Victorians did too, often postponing the ordeal until pain screamed them into submission. And as for braces, improvised wires and gutta-percha rubber hinted at innovation, but not much relief. Hygiene extended to the urban fabric, or failed to. Workhouses, slums, factory dorms were typically jammed, damp, and filthy. Typhus rolled through like an uninvited cousin. Human waste, and I won't paint a gory image, but flooded alleys, until reformers hammered at Parliament long enough to spark infrastructure change. Piped water, sewers, and trash collection eventually improved cities, but not before thousands perished. Progress in this sense always seemed fashionably late. Perhaps most unnerving, the era's belief in balancing the body's invisible energies. Home remedies advised anything from bleeding and leeches to cupping, mustard poultices, or bizarre dietary cures. Feel anxious? Prescribe rest, cod liver oil, or goat's whey. Have a rash? Slap on mercury ointment. One eccentric doctor even promoted electricity as cure-all, strapping electrodes to patients in the name of stimulation. Half laboratory, half circus. Yet one cannot forget mental health. Melancholy and hysteria pepper medical literature, especially for women. Any flicker of imbalance, grief, or even assertiveness drew the dreaded label hysteria. Treatments included rest cures, weeks of forced bed rest, heavy diet, minimal compensation, minimal stimulation. Imagine lying still, bored out of your skull, called therapy. Historians debate whether such treatments sought genuine healing or merely social control over women inconveniently restless. Lest we despair too gloomily, progress did creep in. Public health pioneers like John Snow traced cholera to contaminated water. Florence Nightingale transformed hospital nursing after the Crimean War. Slowly, antiseptics, vaccinations, and sanitation reforms emerged. Each improvement mattered hugely, but implementation took decades, often resisted by those in power. Joke break for sanity. 1. At least when Victorians swallowed laudanum for a cough, they could console themselves by promptly forgetting they even had lungs. 2. Bathing machines may have been prissy, but compared to the public sewer, they started to look like luxury spas. 3. And if your friend said, "I'm off to get a little mercury for my tummy ache," you could smile thinly and whisper, "Well, better shiny than sorry." So you lie back in your chamber, stomach rumbling from too much boiled beef, nerves rattled by outside smells, and you realize health and hygiene here are precarious negotiations, sometimes deadly, sometimes laughable, always revealing how little society knew about its own bodies. Yet amidst the danger, people endured, scrubbing teeth with soot, sniffing posies against plague, trusting tonics, and building slowly, painfully, toward the revolutions of modern medicine. You cough, sip your dubious elixir, pull your shawl tighter, and try to drift into uneasy slumber. Tomorrow the bells will ring, the soot will rise, and somehow you'll still stagger onward. You've made it through the corsets, the syrup bottles of laudanum, and even the bouquet as gas mask stage of hygiene. But now we arrive at what may be the sharpest thorn in the Victorian rosebush, the terrifying omnipresence of public opinion. Welcome to the era where gossip is not just idle chatter. It is surveillance, career-ending, marriage-blocking, reputation-smothering weaponry. Imagine walking through life with your personal choices projected on a giant chalkboard your neighbours check twice daily. As you step out on a foggy morning, you remind yourself to walk steadily, tip your hat at the right angle, keep your gloves spotless. A smear of dirt, a laugh too loud, a missed bow could all become grist for the gossip mill. Respectability is currency here, not metaphorically, truly. Without it, you might be ignored socially, denied job advancement, or even struggled to arrange advantageous marriages for your children. Your social image is not a bonus stat, it is the game. The scandal sheet culture thrived throughout the century. Newspapers sniffed hungrily at indiscretions of the elite. Affairs hinted at, financial slip-ups, young ladies seen without proper chaperones. Mainstream fact, illustrated satirical papers such as Punch lampooned politicians, aristocrats, and occasionally entire social fads ruthlessly. A caricature could burn deeper than a libel charge. It made someone laughable. Which in Victorian society was about as bad as being criminal. Being mocked was a social execution on the public stage. For ordinary households, gossip bred in church pews, drawing room afternoons, tea tables. Who skipped communion last Sunday? Who seemed to overspend on new curtains when their husband's business faltered? Whose daughter exchanged glances too warmly at the promenade? It all mattered. To be talked about was rarely flattering, unless you were specifically praised for virtue or generosity. Otherwise, the talking meant trouble. Take the peculiar protocols for women. A widow seen in public too soon without heavy mourning garb risked whispers of disrespect. A lady dining too merrily without gloves invited speculation about her forward character. One quirky tidbit: there are records of women being critiqued in local papers for carrying umbrellas of too garish a colour. Yes, in a society stewing in coal soot and open sewers, people somehow devoted energy to fretting about umbrella hues. Priorities. Darling, servants, as we've noted before, often acted as undercurrents. They overheard, they saw, and while strict propriety demanded loyalty, reality was often different. Gossip leaped out of kitchens like sparks from the coal fire, passed from butler to grocer to neighbour until reputations warped beyond recognition. Strangely enough, aristocrats too depended on servants to maintain a glittering facade, yet those same servants could unravel charades with one revealing phrase in the wrong ear. Historians still argue whether households feared servants more than loved them, especially in their capacity as silent yet all-seeing chroniclers of high society lives. The obsession with propriety meant everyone staged themselves constantly. Parlour furniture meticulously arranged, proof of moral respectability. Worn shoes spotted by neighbours, a danger sign. Even attending the wrong entertainments raised eyebrows. Working-class music halls were branded improper by middle-class reformers, implying that simply enjoying a bawdy song endangered your eternal soul and your social prospects, which might explain why people snuck off anyway. With veils lowered and stories rehearsed, should anyone ask. Control of image also extended into personal letters. Private correspondence occasionally surfaced in the wrong hands, fueling entire ruinations. Did you write your beloved a line too tender before families formally approved? That scrap might be brandished in anger as proof of indiscretion. Hell hath no fury like a Victorian aunt armed with intercepted stationery. And if you think managing opinions ceased at death, think again. Mourning rituals themselves were designed as public image management. Black crepe, funeral processions, headstones, all watched intently by neighbours. A penny saved by reducing mourning lengths implied coldness. Too lavish a display invited accusations of arrogance. Even grief was weighed, measured, performed. Every so often, though, someone slipped, remarkably, rebelliously. Writers like Oscar Wilde toyed with image deliberately, flamboyantly, thumbing noses at propriety. Wilde's witty persona and public antics scandalized and enchanted in equal measure. But the crushing backlash he eventually endured stands as proof. Society may flirt with rebels, but it rarely forgives them fully. Wilde's downfall became a national spectacle, consumed with the same insatiable appetite as gossip about umbrellas. Joke injection here to lighten the paranoia. 1. In modern times, people overshare on social media. In Victorian times, someone might ruin you by reporting you sneezed too loudly at the opera. Imagine trending for cough etiquette. 2. You think paparazzi are bad? Try Mrs. Whittaker from Church Pew 3, who notices precisely how many sugar lumps you put in your tea. 3. And heaven forbid you recycle last season's bonnet. A muttered, "Didn't she wear that in March?" is reputational doom. Historians still argue whether the suffocating obsession with image fostered greater empathy, since everyone feared judgment, they behaved better, or greater hypocrisy, since everyone lied, prettied up, and hid their faults more deeply. Likely both. A society worshipping appearances inevitably bred performers, some charming, some tragic. And so, as you retreat again into your parlour, you breathe wearily. Respectability is loud silence. It is what keeps your boots polished, your curtains drawn, your smiles careful. It shapes you more tightly than corsets, because at least corsets only suffocate ribs. Reputation whispers through walls, department stores, sermons, carriages, and even onto your gravestone. Living here, you begin to realise a grim truth. You're not only surviving on food, fire, and friends. You're surviving on opinion, constantly guarded, constantly inspected. This is the Victorian panopticon, and everyone is both prisoner and warden. The walls of polished parlours hum with gossip. Corsets constrict with propriety. Gas lamps flicker on schedules stricter than half the vicars. And yet, beneath all this performance, something stirs. You can feel it, the tension, like seams that creak when a dress is laced too tight. Victorian society starts to strain under its own rules. And here arrives one of the most curious chapters of living through the age. The reformers, the agitators, the weary voices shouting, "Surely there's a better way." You wake into the latter half of the century, feeling a faint energy in the foggy air. Across town, newspapers trumpet stories about conditions in coal mines, lives lost in factories, the hunger in slums. Reformers walk into Parliament with charts, stats, and impassioned speeches. Mainstream fact: it was during Victoria's reign that massive reforms came rolling out. The Factory Acts restricted work hours for women and children, though enforcement lagged miserably. One noisy crack: the suffrage movement. Women, long corseted not just in dress but in political silence, begin to organise. Petitions circulate, meetings swell. The voice of suffrage is not the deafening roar it will later be in Edwardian years, but in parlours and lecture halls, debates spark. Should women be educated, allowed to vote, allowed to own property, rather than being the property? Historians still argue whether early Victorian suffrage leaders were radical radicals or simply pragmatic reformers testing limits softly. Either way, their voices ignite suspicion, admiration, and endless editorials. Meanwhile, working-class men clamour too. The Chartist movement earlier in the century laid groundwork by demanding voting rights and parliamentary reform for all men, not just wealthy landowners. Their rallies were massive, sometimes frightening to the elite. Oh, Parliament shuttered them repeatedly. They planted seeds that yielded broader enfranchisement later. A candle flickers. Even gaslights cannot deny it. Out on the streets, reformers campaign against grim poverty in cities, where whole families cram into single cellar rooms. Philanthropists like Octavia Hill champion better housing. Charles Booth publishes maps of poverty in London, colouring districts shocking shades of black to show destitution. For the first time, numbers make inequality undeniable. Neat dinner conversations about soup spoons begin colliding with murmurs of change. Voices also erupt around temperance. Respectable women form organisations swearing off gin and ale, campaigning to ban liquor. Picture bands of bonneted matrons storming taverns, hymn books blazing, trying to coax drunkards away with scripture and biscuits. For some, temperance is moral crusade. For others, an early blueprint of women flexing political power in public. But critics mutter that these campaigns ignore poverty's real causes: low wages, not beer mugs. Historians still argue whether temperance saved families or simply tried to control them. Education, too, reforms. With the Education Act of 1870, schooling becomes mandatory for children ages 5 to 10. Ragged schools, once patched together by charities, expand. For the first time, a whole generation of children learns their ABCs, and literacy transforms culture. Cheap penny dreadful papers spread lurid crime stories to working-class youths, both thrilling and alarming moralists. Imagine a parent fretting because their child is hiding shocking tales of highwaymen beneath geography primers. The great irony. Literacy itself unlocks voices, but not always voices the establishment approves. And then, of course, the great debates between faith and science, morality and progress. Darwin's evolution lingers like a thundercloud. Tracts are published defending the Bible. Counter-tracts insisting humans share kinship with apes. Dinner tables tremble with arguments. Some families cling tighter to pews. Others peer excitedly through microscopes. A quirky tidbit: one eccentric preacher tried to harmonize scripture with science by proposing that Eden had merely been a superior garden experiment set by God before evolution rolled on. Imaginative, if not entirely convincing. Behind the lofty campaigns, simple human resistance thrives too. Think of women sneaking into lectures disguised in men's attire. Or working-class families quietly ignoring Sabbath restrictions to visit music halls on Sunday evenings. Or servants deliberately forgetting to announce callers they knew would bore their mistress. Not revolutions, no fireworks, but steady acts of defiance, slowly wearing grooves into rigid rules. And class boundaries strain. Industrialists grow richer than centuries-old aristocrats. A new elite emerges, built not on titles, but on factories, mines, and railways. Nobility sneers, yet marries into trade fortunes anyway, because money oils everything. This mingling rattles the old order, even while it cements new forms of snobbery. Historians still debate whether Victorian society truly democratized by the end of the century, or merely exchanged old hierarchies for new ones. Did social mobility flourish, or did the ladder remain firmly roped off? Reform also pulsed through art and literature. Writers like Elizabeth Gaskell exposed the horrors of industrial poverty. Charles Dickens turned novels into campaigns for awareness, his stories piling pressure on Parliament itself. Meanwhile, radicals like William Morris declared that design and craftsmanship must uplift common people, challenging soulless industrial products. Even wallpaper became a statement. A damask pattern could whisper resistance to factory sludge. 3 jokes to cut through the fog here. 1. Victorian Parliament debated sewage disposal while literally choking on the Great Stink. Imagine arguing tax bills while gagging. Policy making at its most aromatic. 2. Suffragists handing out pamphlets probably invented the first passive-aggressive flyer game. One slip in your hand, louder than hours of dinner small talk. 3. Picture earnest reformers begging people to bathe, while a gentleman insists weekly vinegar gargles are enough. Hygiene meet optimism. By evening, you sit back, the fire crackling. Outside, you imagine posters advertising lectures on social purity, school committees petitioning for funds, and political cartoons lampooning gas lamp legislation. It feels restless. This society that polices every spoon, every glove, every syllable, is beginning to trip over its own rigidity. Reform surges, not from revolution, but from sheer exhaustion. The recognition that you can't lace corsets tighter forever before someone gasps for air. And so, as you pull your shawl closer, you sense the change humming. It's uneven, contested, mocked, resisted, but it's there. Whether it's the schoolchild learning letters, the chartist shouting in a square, or the suffragist scribbling quietly at her kitchen table. These murmurs of rebellion thicken into voices. Victorian Britain may love its rules, its starch, its sermons, but human restlessness inevitably seeps through, demanding more than just respectability. The fog has thickened. Your boots ache from miles of trudging through ritual and propriety. And now, it's time to exhale. We stand at the final act of this Victorian stage play, looking backward with tired but astonished eyes at the rules that governed every sigh, sneeze, spoon, and handshake. Living under Queen Victoria's stern gaze meant not only surviving coal smoke and laudanum, but surviving the weight of endless etiquette. And yet, as you brush the soot from your coat cuffs, you realize those rules didn't end with the century. They seeped forward, echoing into our modern lives like faint hymns through old chapel windows. Look around you today. How do you greet someone? Not with a loud, slobbering kiss, thank heavens, but with a polite handshake or nod. Thank the Victorians for codifying that little ritual. Dining etiquette too. Placing napkins on laps, using cutlery in polite outward to inward progressions, chewing with mouths closed, are all faint descendants of Victorian fussiness. They turned meals into social sermons, and we've inherited the milder aftertaste. Consider gender norms. Though loosened immensely, traces remain in cultural assumptions people still wrestle with. Expectations about who should be tidy, nurturing, ambitious, stoic. You wore those corsets in section 10, remember? Luckily, we laced ourselves out of those literal prisons, but figurative strings remain. Historians still argue whether Victorian gender scripts created modern dichotomies or merely exaggerated older ones. Either way, we're still untangling the ribbons. Even the Victorian obsession with public respectability lives on. Social media today echoes those scandal sheets of Section 15, reputation managed via photographs. Whispered likes and dislikes spreading as quickly as drawing room gossip. We may no longer faint at garish umbrellas, but hashtags now carry their own whisper networks. One viral post can ruin you as efficiently as Mrs. Whittaker down in Pew 3 ever did. And leisure? Well, think of seaside picnics, board games, theatre nights. We still gravitate toward gatherings that display social bonds, even if we now laugh louder, reveal more knee, and thankfully skip bathing machines. The waltz has dwindled, but the dance floor, literal or metaphorical, still embodies both romance and reputation. The Victorian home, too, echoes in ours. We may not employ armies of footmen, but notions of a well-run house persist. A tidy living space remains a badge of pride, and the invisible weight of domestic labour remains unevenly carried. Remember those housekeepers we peeked at in Section 9? Their descendants live on in the unpaid work accepted so quietly, yet driving every family forward. Quirky tidbit to carry with you. Etiquette manuals didn't vanish, they evolved. Walk into a bookstore today and you'll still see neat rows of how to behave, how to succeed, how to present confidence. The fonts are friendlier, but the impulse is ancient. Tell us the rules so we can survive the social arena. 3 light jokes before we dim the lamps for good. 1. At least you don't have to choose the right grape fork anymore. Grapes today come pre-packaged, judgment-free. 2. No one's demanding you sniff lavender bouquets against smog, though air freshener commercials feel oddly similar. 3. And if corsets had survived wholesale into modern gyms, half our fitness classes would just involve fainting gracefully onto a couch. Yet beneath the laughter, there's a sobering respect. As rigid and strange as the Victorians seem to us, their age wrestled with modernization's first roar. Industry, urbanization, empire, scientific upheaval. Surrounded by chaos, they chose rules as lifeboats. Rules didn't just constrain, they comforted. They gave structure when steam whistles and strange machines made the world dizzyingly new. For every suffocating corset, there was also a reassurance. This is how we do things. This is who we are. Perhaps without such order, society might have spiraled faster than it already did. And so here, standing at the close of the 19th century, you glance once more through coal-fogged gas lamp light. Your fellow Londoners shuffle away, skirts swishing, hats bobbing, hands clutching parasols or ledgers. They're trapped, yes, but also surviving, stubbornly pushing on. These endless rules of Victorian life shaped them in ways that still pour silently into our bones today. Rules about posture, respectability, silence, grace, gender, labour, morality. Some we shrugged off, some we carry knowingly, some ride our shoulders invisibly. You sigh, loosening your collar or unlacing that corset decisively. You've made it. Through streets, kitchens, parlours, schools, workhouses, dance halls, doctors' absurdities, whispers of reform. You've played the part with cautious bows and careful nods. And now, curtain call. The audience of neighbours, gossips, and clergymen fades. The Victorian story lingers, not because it's entirely past, but because echoes of its rules still rustle every time we fold napkins, straighten collars, worry about appearances, or whisper, "Don't make a scene." Now, let your breath slow. Imagine those gaslit streets, dimming down to shadow, one by one. The fog rolls in softly, not menacingly now, but like a warm quilt folding across cobblestones. The bells that once barked orders into servants' ears fall quiet, their metal tongues still at last. Streets that clamoured with horses now settle into hush. The clop of hooves and rattle of wheels, nothing more than a fading rhythm in memory. Picture yourself reclining in a high-backed chair, the fire glowing low, heat breathing gently against your cheeks. No more starch, no more ceremony, only the weightless comfort of release. The corset's laces unknotted, the collar buttons undone, slippers warming by the hearth. The house itself exhales, pipes and rafters creak softly, not in duty anymore, but in rest. Drift back through the day we've travelled. The crowded schools, the suffocating manners at dinner, the whispered scandals in pews, the romances spied on by ever-watchful aunts, all blurred now into smoke. What remains is the lesson of endurance, that even when life imposes countless rules, humanity squeezes laughter through the cracks, finds warmth in camaraderie, and keeps walking with stubborn feet on cobbled ground. Close your eyes, let the pace slow to a whisper. Phrases stretching long and gentle, each syllable a lull against the noise of the outside world. Imagine Victorian fog not as a choking smog, but as a soft protective mist, wrapping you gently, holding you. In that stillness lies rest, and in that rest, peace. And so we end, together, lanterns dimmed, voices softened, drifting. Sweet dreams, traveller.